Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? We're tackling a big one today, racism in America. But we're going beyond the usual focus on the Black experience.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring how racism has affected other marginalized groups too. Groups that don't always get the same attention.
Exactly. Like, for instance, did you know the U.S. government actually used this concept called the doctrine of discovery to justify taking land from Native Americans?
It's a really disturbing part of history. Basically, this doctrine said European powers could claim any land that wasn't inhabited by Christians.
So basically, they were using religion to justify stealing land.
Pretty much. It's a prime example of how laws were used to dispossess and dehumanize entire populations.
Wow, that's messed up. And then you have events like the Trail of Tears. I mean, the forced relocation of Native American tribes. That was a really dark chapter.
Absolutely. The Trail of Tears was a deliberate policy of forced assimilation. The government wanted to erase indigenous cultures and take their land for white settlement.
And the Trail of Tears caused thousands of deaths too, right?
Yeah, it did. And it also led to the dismantling of tribal sovereignty.
It's like the government was saying, be more like us or get out of the way. And it didn't end there, did it?
Yeah.
I mean, they also created these boarding schools to strip Native American children of their culture and language.
Yeah, those schools were designed to erase Native American identity. Kids were punished for speaking their native languages. Their hair was cut. Traditional clothing was forbidden.
Jeez. It's
Yeah.
just awful.
Yeah. And the trauma from that era is something that still affects indigenous communities today.
It's heartbreaking. And, you know, it's crazy how this kind of thing just keeps repeating throughout history. Let's shift gears and talk about Hispanic Latino Americans for a minute. The Mexican-American War was obviously a huge turning point, but what happened to the Mexicans who were already living in the territories that the U.S. took over?
Well, their home suddenly became part of a new country, but instead of being welcomed, they were treated like second-class citizens.
So even though they were now part of the U.S., they still weren't treated equally.
Right. They faced discrimination, they lost their land, and they were stripped of their political rights.
That's rough. And then you have all those Latino immigrants, especially from Mexico, who came to the U.S. and became a major source of cheap labor.
Yeah, programs like the Bracero program, while they might have seemed like opportunities on the surface, often exploited these workers,
So they were working in terrible conditions and getting paid very little.
and they were easily discarded when they were no longer needed. It shows how economic needs were often put ahead of basic human rights.
It's a pattern we see again and again throughout history. And it wasn't just about labor, right? I mean, weren't there actually signs that said, no Mexicans allowed? That's straight up discrimination.
Oh, yeah. Segregation wasn't just for Black Americans. No Mexicans allowed. Signs were pretty common. And things could even get violent. Like, remember the Zoot Suit riots?
Refresh my memory on those.
Okay, so in the 1940s, young Mexican-American men who wore Zoot Suits, which were seen as flashy by some people, were attacked by white servicemen and civilians.
Because of their clothes.
It was totally racially motivated. It shows how something as simple as clothing could become a target for prejudice and aggression.
Wow. Crazy how deeply ingrained this prejudice was. Speaking of deeply ingrained prejudice, let's move on to Asian Americans.
Ah.
I've always heard this term yellow peril, but never really understood what it meant.
The Yellow Peril was this racist idea that Asian immigrants posed a threat to Western civilization. It was this fear-mongering that painted Asians as this dangerous other.
So it was more than just dislike. It was like this deep-seated fear.
And that fear had real consequences. Think about the Chinese massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles. A white mob just went and attacked and murdered Chinese residents.
Like because they were Chinese.
Yeah. And that wasn't an isolated incident either. It was part of this bigger pattern of anti-Asian violence.
It's scary how easily fear can turn into violence. And this whole yellow peril idea led to the Chinese Exclusion Act too, right?
Exactly. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was America's first major law restricting immigration based solely on race or nationality.
So it specifically targeted the Chinese.
It barred Chinese laborers from entering the country, and it denied citizenship to those who were already here. It was a really dangerous precedent for discriminatory legislation.
So from the very beginning, Asian Americans were facing exclusion and discrimination. It's a reminder that the American dream wasn't for everyone. And this prejudice wasn't just limited to the Chinese, was it? What about Japanese immigrants?
Oh, they faced their own set of challenges, too. Japanese immigrants who started coming in larger numbers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries also faced a lot of hostility.
Like what kind of hostility?
Well, They were often denied citizenship, and they had restrictions on land ownership, all because of that same fear of the other.
It's like this vicious cycle of fear and discrimination.
Hmm.
But when we're talking about anti-Asian racism, the Japanese-American internment during World War II has to be one of the most shocking examples, right?
It really is. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which basically authorized the forced removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from their homes on the West Coast.
And most of these people were American citizens, right?
Yeah, but they were still incarcerated in camps. They were stripped of their freedom and their possessions.
It's mind-boggling that this happened in a country that claims to value freedom and justice. How could they justify imprisoning innocent people just because of their ancestry?
Fear and prejudice can be powerful forces, especially during times of war. This mass incarceration had devastating consequences for Japanese Americans. They lost their homes, their businesses, their communities.
It's a dark chapter in American history, a reminder of how easily fear can erode our values and lead to injustice. It makes you wonder how many other groups faced similar discrimination.
Unfortunately, there are a lot, and we've only just begun to explore them. Let's talk about another group that has faced a long history of prejudice in America: Jewish Americans.
Okay. I know anti-Semitism has deep roots in Europe, but I'm curious about how it played out in America. I mean, wasn't America supposed to be a safe haven from religious persecution?
It's a complicated history. While America did offer opportunities, it wasn't a utopia free from prejudice. From the very beginning, Jewish Americans faced religious discrimination and exclusion.
So even in the land of the free, they weren't actually free from prejudice. What kinds of discrimination did they experience?
It took many different forms, from social exclusion to outright violence. In the 19th century, Jewish Americans were often barred from certain professions and social circles. And as more Jewish immigrants arrived from Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism in America actually intensified.
Oh, it got worse over time.
Sadly, yes. And there were some really horrific incidents that highlight the level of prejudice they faced. Take the case of Leo Frank in 1913. He was a Jewish factory superintendent in Atlanta who was falsely accused and convicted of murdering a young girl.
So he was innocent.
The evidence against him was really flimsy, but he was still convicted, and later he was lynched by a mob that was driven by anti-Semitic hatred.
Wow. That's a chilling example of how prejudice can turn deadly. It shows how deep those biases ran. And it wasn't just isolated incidents like that, was it? Were there any prominent figures who openly espoused anti-Semitic views?
Yeah, unfortunately, Henry Ford, the car guy, was a notorious anti-Semite. He used his newspaper and his influence to spread a lot of hateful propaganda.
And blaming Jews for problems in society.
He was, and his writings were widely read, which further normalized anti-Semitism in American society.
It's alarming how people in positions of power can use their platforms to spread hatred. It makes you think, did the Holocaust, the genocide of European Jews, have any impact on anti-Semitism in America?
The Holocaust definitely shocked the world, and it exposed the horrors of unchecked hatred. But even after witnessing something so horrific, discrimination against Jewish Americans continued.
Really? I mean, how is that even possible after what happened?
Progress isn't always a straight line. While overt anti-Semitism might have decreased, more subtle forms of it persisted.
So it became less obvious, but it was still there.
Yeah. Jewish Americans still faced barriers in housing and employment. They were excluded from certain neighborhoods and denied jobs because of their religion.
So just acknowledging the problem wasn't enough to solve it. How does all this historical anti-Semitism connect to what's happening today? Do Jewish Americans still face discrimination?
Sadly, yes. Anti-Semitism is on the rise again. There's been a disturbing increase in hate crimes, vandalism of synagogues, and the spread of conspiracy theories online.
So this ancient hatred is still alive and well. This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to how pervasive racism is in America and how it's affected so many different communities. It's not just a black and white issue.
You got it. Recognizing the diverse experiences of all these marginalized groups is crucial if we want to understand the full impact of racism on American society. And there's still so much more to uncover.
Yeah, we've covered a lot, but we're just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll go even deeper into this complex history of racism in America and look at how we can move towards a more just and equitable future. Welcome back. It's been a pretty heavy stuff so far, but also really eye-opening, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. It's fascinating to see how racism has impacted so many different communities throughout American history.
Right. We left off talking about how European immigrants faced discrimination, especially the Irish and the Italians. But I'm guessing other European groups probably encountered prejudice too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Polish, Greek, Eastern European immigrants, they often faced a lot of the same challenges.
It's kind of interesting how even within the category of European, there were these hierarchies of acceptance, like whiteness wasn't this fixed thing.
Exactly. It was constantly being negotiated and redefined. Anyone who was seen as different or other could face prejudice and be denied opportunities.
So it really shows how racism is about power and control, creating categories and hierarchies to benefit certain groups.
Right. And this deep dive isn't just about recounting historical facts. It's about understanding how these dynamics of racism have played out across different communities.
I'm starting to see those connections more clearly now. Okay, so we've looked at the historical experiences of different marginalized groups, but what are some of the big overarching themes and patterns we've seen so far?
Well, one of the most striking things is how stereotypes are used to dehumanize and justify discrimination against different groups. We saw this with the yellow peril myth used against Asian Americans, the way Irish immigrants were portrayed as drunks and criminals, and the association of Italian Americans with organized crime.
It's interesting how these stereotypes reduce people to these simple, often negative images.
Yeah, they strip away people's humanity and make it easier to justify treating them unfairly. Stereotypes are powerful tools of oppression. They become part of the dominant narrative, and they even influence public policy.
Another thing we've seen is how marginalized groups often get scapegoated during times of economic hardship or social upheaval.
Yeah, sadly, that's a classic tactic. When times are tough, people look for someone to blame. And marginalized groups who are already vulnerable become easy targets.
Like with the Chinese Exclusion Act, that was passed during an economic
And
recession.
right. And then there was the Mexican repatriation during the Great Depression, when thousands of Mexican Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were forced out of the country.
So basically, when anxieties rise, so does prejudice.
It's a pattern that keeps repeating itself throughout history. And we even see it in more recent times, like with the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment and Islamophobia after 9/11 and the 2008 recession.
It's a reminder that racism is often tied to economic and political anxieties. And if we want to dismantle these harmful systems, we need to understand those connections.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing how these different forces intersect and how they can be used to create divisions and justify discrimination.
Okay, so we've identified some of the big themes and patterns, but where do we go from here? What can we do with this understanding of the history of racism?
Well, the first step is acknowledging the impact of racism on American society. We can't move forward unless we really confront our past.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding how those historical injustices continue to shape our present.
Exactly. And it's not just about acknowledging the harm, it's about actively working to repair that harm and create a more just future.
So what does that look like in practice? How do we move beyond just awareness and actually create real change?
Well, education is key. We need to teach accurate and inclusive history that represents the experiences of all marginalized groups.
So we need to move beyond those simplistic narratives that we often get in textbooks.
Yeah. And education isn't just about formal schooling. It's about having those difficult conversations, challenging our own biases, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
It's about being willing to listen and learn from people who have different experiences than our own.
Right. And it's not just about individual learning. It's about transforming our institutions and systems to reflect the values of equity and justice.
So looking at our laws, our policies, our practices, and seeing what needs to change.
Exactly. And it's about creating opportunities for everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or religion.
So addressing things like economic inequality, access to healthcare and education, and reforming the criminal justice system, these are big issues.
They are, but they're all connected to the history of racism we've been talking about.
It's about building a society where everyone has a chance to thrive. A society where difference is celebrated and not feared.
That's the goal.
This has been tough, but inspiring. I've learned a lot, and I feel like I still have a lot to learn. It's made me realize how much work still needs to be done. But it's also given me hope that we can create a better future.
I agree. It won't be easy, but by understanding our past and working together, we can build a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to discuss.
Wow, yeah, we've just scratched the surface. And the final part of this deep dive will go even deeper into the complexities of racism in America and talk about ways to move forward.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive. Wow, this has been a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. We've uncovered some tough stuff, but also some incredible stories of resilience, you know? Those stories give me hope that change is possible.
Yeah, for sure. So we were talking about how racism is systemic, like how it's built into our institutions, and how we need to work to dismantle those systems. But it's not as simple as just race, is it?
No, not at all. We have to remember that racism intersects with all sorts of other forms of oppression. Sexism, classism, homophobia, ableism.
It's like these different forms of oppression, they all kind of work together, don't they?
Exactly. They overlap and reinforce each other. And that creates even bigger challenges for people who are facing multiple forms of discrimination.
Right, like a Latina woman might experience discrimination not just because of her ethnicity, but also because of her gender.
Exactly. Or a gay Asian man might face prejudice because of his sexual orientation and his race.
So we can't just address these issues separately.
You got it. We have to recognize that people have multiple identities. And those identities can overlap in ways that make them much more vulnerable to discrimination.
This is what they call intersectionality, right?
Exactly. Intersectionality helps us understand how power and privilege work in our society. And it shows us that we can't really dismantle racism without addressing all these other forms of oppression, too.
Okay, so we need to think about all these interconnected systems. But what can we actually do to dismantle them? How do we go from just talking about it to taking action and making a real difference?
Well, one of the most powerful things we have is our voice. Speaking out against injustice, challenging those racist jokes or comments that we hear, using our platforms to amplify the voices of marginalized people.
So it's about not just being a bystander.
Right. Silence is complicity. We have to use our voices to challenge the status quo and demand justice.
And it's not just about our personal lives either, is it? We have to be politically engaged too.
Absolutely. Voting for candidates who support policies that promote equality and justice. Contacting our elected officials and advocating for change. Holding them accountable.
So being informed and engaged citizens, using our political power to create a more just society. But what do you do when it feels like the people in power aren't listening?
Well, that's where supporting grassroots organizations and movements comes in. You know, those groups that are working on the ground to fight racism and oppression. Donating, volunteering, raising awareness about their work.
And it's important to support organizations that are led by members of the communities they serve, right?
Absolutely. We need to make sure that the people who are most affected by injustice have a voice and a leadership role. It's about shifting power to those who have been marginalized and excluded.
This whole deep dive has been such a learning experience. It's a reminder that the fight for justice isn't over. It can feel overwhelming sometimes, but it also feels empowering, knowing that we can all do something.
I agree. It's easy to get discouraged, but every action we take, no matter how small, is a step towards a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that racism isn't just a thing of the past. It's still happening every day. It's a living issue that affects real people's lives.
And that we all have a responsibility to do something about it, to work towards a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and grow and work together to make things better.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some important conversations and inspired you to take action.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for change.
And we'll see you on the next deep dive.